Let's take a look now at the examples from the text of anti-slavery rhetoric and literature. I want to take these examples roughly in chronological order, though I do want to end with a discussion of Uncle Tom's Cabin as an important text in American history, and a text that honestly deserves more attention than we were able to give it in a compressed format course like this one. But nevertheless, I hope to instill a bit of curiosity in you about the text, perhaps give you something that you might want to continue looking at after this course has concluded. On page 742 of the Norton Anthology of American Literature, Volume B, 10th edition, you have an excerpt from Angelina Grimké's Appeal to the Christian Women of the South. Part of what makes Grimké a fascinating figure is that she is born and raised in a family that enslaved other humans in Charleston, South Carolina. She moves to Philadelphia in the 1820s, and in the 1830s, she becomes a fervent supporter of what is called Garrisonian abolitionism. The adjective Garrisonian is in reference to William Lloyd Garrison. And in the previous discussion, we talked about the fact that some individuals involved in politics or involved in social movements saw slavery as an institution that in time would die out, and even argued that the United States was formed with that idea in mind. But William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist and writer and editor William Lloyd Garrison, who edited The Liberator from 1831 until the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in December 1865, Garrison was an absolute abolitionist who believed that there was no phase out possible, that it needed to instead be completely done away with as fast as possible, as quickly as possible. Appeal to Christian Women of the South is a text from 1836, and the idea here is Grimké is appealing directly, in her argumentation and persuasion, appealing directly to women as a political force who can play a role in ending slavery. She writes on page 753, "I know you do not make the laws, but I also know that you are the wives and mothers, the sisters and daughters of those who do. And if you really suppose you can do nothing to overthrow slavery, you are greatly mistaken." And Grimké proposes 4 things that she says women can do to help bring about the end of slavery, even though women are not enfranchised to vote, and even though women at this time, as we talked about in our lecture on women in the 19th century, are still denied a lot of rights under the law. Grimké says there are nevertheless certain things that women can do to help bring about an end to slavery in the United States. And she proposes these 4 things: that people can read on the subject, that they can pray on the subject, that they can speak on the subject, and that they can act on the subject. Grimké's text is a wonderful example related to the political discussions and philosophical discussions of slavery in the United States. But think about the parallels that Grimké is making with some of the other writers who we've looked at so far. People like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, people like Lydia Marie Child, or Judith Sargent Murray. At the core of Grimké's argument is an argument of the importance of education. And that education itself is going to empower women, and that through education they can actually achieve measurable political ends. When she talks about reading on the subject of slavery, she talks about you can read really any book that's going to help grow your mind on the subject of slavery, but she has one in mind. It's called the Bible. She says here, it is hardly probable that your committees of vigilance will allow you to have any other book than the Bible. The Bible is the book that I want you to read on the spirit of inquiry and in the spirit of prayer. She asks repeatedly that they consider deeply the words of the Bible and, quote, judge for yourselves whether he sanctioned such a system of oppression and crime. She encourages women to pray on the subject of slavery and also to speak on the subject of slavery. This was part of an overall approach to the abolitionist movement called moral suasion. The idea that through social interactions with individuals, you can change people's minds on the topic of slavery. And it's separate from like the political approach or the legal approach to the way that slavery was handled, but instead a focus on the conversational, the moral, the literary, the educated. In time, that is ultimately seen as not enough, but at the time, in the late 1830s, at the time Grimké is writing, it's a key strategy in trying to pick up steam on the abolitionist movement. So she says, when she encourages people to speak on the subject, she says, it's through the tongue, the pen, and the press that truth is principally propagated. Speak then to your relatives, your friends, your acquaintances on the subject of slavery. Be not afraid if you are conscientiously convinced it is sinful to say so openly, but calmly, and to let your sentiments be known. If you are served by the slaves of others, try to ameliorate their condition as much as possible. Never aggravate their faults and thus add fuel to the fire of anger already kindled in a master and mistress's bosom. Remember their extreme ignorance and consider them how your heavenly Father does the less capable on this account, even when they do wrong things. Discountenance all cruelty to them, all starvation, all corporal chastisement. These may brutalize and break their spirits, but will never bend them to willing, cheerful obedience. But she says, and this is the important part where her argument not only fits the abolitionist anti-slavery rhetoric, but also fits in with other writings that we've looked at related to women in the course. At the bottom of page 754, above all, try to persuade your husband, father, brothers, and sons that slavery is a crime against God and man, and that it is a great sin to keep human beings in such abject ignorance, to deny them the privilege of learning to read and write. So Grimké's argument, much like other abolitionist arguments during this time, come from a sense of the moral problems with slavery, the religious problems with slavery. And we'll see this when we turn to Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin, that there's a moral problem, a religious problem, a theological and Christian problem with slavery that needs to be discussed and reflected upon. I want to turn now to the rhetoric in Frederick Douglass's What to the Slave is the 4th of July. The Norton Anthology, unfortunately, does not print the entirety of Douglass's address. It's worth reading in whole. It's one of the great speeches in all of American history, and certainly the greatest of the abolitionist speeches. Douglass was called to Rochester, New York, before a mixed audience of men and women, and also just a diverse anti-slavery cause, to give a 4th of July oration. And as part of that oration, Douglass reframes the purpose and wonders why he someone who has escaped from slavery and has no legal rights in the United States, why he has been called upon to celebrate the 4th of July, the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It's hard not to just stand here and read all of this excerpt out loud, but I want to read certain portions of the text and get a full sense of kind of the argument that Douglass is laying out, and to think about the way he's using language. Fellow citizens, he says on page 1144, pardon me and allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Be mindful of the pronouns Douglass uses throughout this excerpt, right? There's a separation here of I, my, we, and us, and you, and your. In other words, people who are in the audience are celebrating the 4th of July because they have liberty under the laws, though some more than others, right? The relationship between men and women at this time, certainly complicated in that regard. But Douglass is denied of even the basic rights of citizenship in the nation. Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? He says on 1145, I say it with a sad sense of disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Further on down the page, he says, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilant shouts that reach them. The chains of slavery are heavier when you hear someone else celebrating liberty. He says, my subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day and its popular characteristics from the slave's point of view. So he reframes the discussion around the idea of examining the 4th of July through the lens of an enslaved person's eyes. And he says on the top of page 1146, he explains the rhetorical choice that he's about to make. He says, I will use the severest language I can command. And yet not one word shall escape me that any man whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice or who is not at heart a slaveholder shall not confess to be right and just. But I fancy I hear some of my audience say, it is just in this circumstance that you and your brother abolitionists fail to make a favorable impression on the public mind. Would you argue more and denounce less? Would you persuade more and rebuke less? Your cause would be much more likely to succeed. But I submit, where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. Interestingly, Douglass is framing the debate around slavery as not a debate at all. That it's resolved. A recognition in 1852 that slavery is a moral wrong. That one doesn't have to engage in a debate over whether slavery is right or wrong. Slavery is just wrong. And he calls out the people who say, well, can't you just be a little kinder? Don't denounce so much. Just engage in a little more argumentation, in a little more persuasion, in a little more logical discussion, right? Persuade more and rebuke less. Try to convince people that you're right. Don't just stand there and wag your finger at them and tell them that they're wrong. And Douglass's response is, I submit, where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. At what point in the anti-slavery creed would you have me argue? On what branch of the subject do the people of this country need light? Must I undertake to prove that the slave is a man? That point is conceded already. Nobody doubts it. The slaveholders themselves acknowledge it in the enactment of laws for their government. They acknowledge it when they punish disobedience on the part of the slave. There are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia, which if committed by a black man, no matter how ignorant he be, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of those same crimes will subject a white man to the like punishment. What is this but an acknowledgement that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being? The manhood of the slave is conceded. Now, interestingly, note the movement that he's able to perform here, right? He's simultaneously advancing the argument while at the same time suggesting he doesn't need to advance the argument. He's recounting the facts that people already are familiar with, while at the same time restating all of those facts that also invest in the argument itself and continue it. So he's doing a very sophisticated rhetorical maneuver where he says he's not arguing, but at the same time he is arguing. But it's all in service of the larger point that he doesn't need to argue. It's a brilliant rhetorical maneuver on his part. Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty, that he is the rightful owner of his body? You have already declared it, he says. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? Is that a question for Republicans? Is it to be settled by the rules of logic and argumentation as a matter beset with great difficulty, involving a doubtful application of the principle of justice, hard to be understood? How should I look today in the presence of Americans, dividing and subdividing a discourse to show that men have a natural right to freedom? What is to be argued? What remains to be argued? He says. There's no more arguments. Is it that slavery is not divine, that God did not establish it, that our doctors of divinity are mistaken? There's blasphemy in that thought. That which is inhuman cannot be divine, he says. Who can reason on such a proposition? They that can may, I cannot. The time for such argument is past, he says. And this is one of Douglass's most famous paragraphs that follows. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument, is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not the light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. And the crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. It's got a parallel structure there, right? The blank of the nation must be blank. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, Douglass says. There's not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Go where you may, search where you will, roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world, travel through South America, search out every abuse, and what you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without rival. He draws attention to the fact that he's going to chastise, he's going to engage in strong rebuking rhetoric. That's what he's going to do, and then he engages in it. Right? He lays the groundwork for why he's going to do it, and then he engages in it. I asked you as well to take a look at some rhetoric from Abraham Lincoln in the House Divided speech. And understanding the context that leads up to this historical moment is really important for understanding what Lincoln himself is actually doing in this address. This address was delivered in 1858. It's the close of the Republican State Convention. This is the year that Lincoln is running for the Senate against Stephen Douglas. This is, in many respects, the speech that he has delivered. He's been given the nomination for the Republican Party to run against Douglas, and this is the speech that he delivers. He starts with very biblical language at the start, and Lincoln is a particularly fascinating figure in a course like this. He's a politician in the same way that Jefferson is a politician, and we've read some of Jefferson, and other politicians. Franklin is a politician, though he doesn't, run for office and serve in the same way that Jefferson does. He's an ambassador, he's involved in politics, he's involved in governance, so on and so forth. Lincoln is a prose stylist in the same way that those men are prose stylists. Every word of Lincoln's addresses he wrote himself. That's rare for many politicians today, that they write by themselves like this. But Lincoln engaged not only in big speeches and the big famous speeches of his presidency, but Lincoln also engaged, he wrote letters, he wrote public letters that would be published in newspapers, he would write personal letters to people. He read voraciously, loved Shakespeare. He was not a man who was well educated, but he had a brilliant mind and quite the capacity to engage in extraordinary rhetoric. What I want to focus on is some of the literary choices that Lincoln engages in. Not only is he talented at the skills of rhetoric, but he's also really great at cadence and rhythm. And he's also really great at images and humor. Humor is an understated value of great writing and great rhetoric. It takes a very talented person to be able to deliver something with a wink and a nudge and a smile. And Lincoln has that capacity. He was able to fuse, I think, high-minded rhetoric of politics and governance with a very common voice. He's not a patrician in the same way that Jefferson is a patrician. He's got probably more in common with Franklin than he does with Jefferson, even though Jefferson was also a president. If we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it. So he's talking here about we need to understand what has brought us up to this point. The formation of the Republican Party, the running against Douglas, all of the events that make Douglas unfit for office. We are now far into the 5th year. since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. And that's a reference to the Compromise of 1850. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Which is a quote from the Gospels, the Gospel of Mark. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in a course of ultimate extinction, or the advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. Have we no tendency to the latter condition? And what he means by that, have we no tendency to the latter condition, is based on where we have been, based on where it seems like we're going at this moment, doesn't it seem more likely that slavery's advocates are going to win than slavery's opponents? Right? There's a little bit of trying to incite some fear in the audience. Let anyone who doubts carefully contemplate that now almost complete legal combination, piece of machinery, so to speak, compounded of the Nebraska Doctrine and the Dred Scott decision. Let him consider not only what work the machinery is adapted to do and how well adapted, but also let him study the history of its construction and trace if he can, or rather fail if he can, to trace the evidences of design and concerted action among its chief bosses from the beginning. What Lincoln is evoking here is a common idea that circulated among anti-slavery circles called the slave power conspiracy. The idea of the slave power conspiracy was that people in the highest reaches of government, the president, the chief justice of the Supreme Court, figures in Congress, were working in tandem with each other to make the federal government increasingly friendly to the institution of slavery. When Lincoln evokes the image of the machinery, this is the kind of thing that he's talking about. He's drawing attention to the fact that Congress is doing certain actions, the president is doing certain actions, the Supreme Court is doing certain actions, and they all seem like they're working together to establish a permanent position of slavery. What Lincoln calls the tendency toward making slavery lawful everywhere. The house divided against itself cannot stand. Lincoln's drawing to the surface here a key question that consumed Northerners and Southerners alike during this time. Probably the best way to frame it is, I've heard it framed is the way the historian David Blight has framed it. And Blight says that the question of the legal status of slavery in the territories is in effect a question of its moral status everywhere. In other words, if you're going to say slavery is wrong and therefore should not expand into the territories, then aren't you in effect saying slavery is morally wrong everywhere it currently exists, right? That kind of puts into dimension what's at risk in the debate here. The northern states believe if you allow slavery to expand into the territories, it won't be long before slavery expands into the north. And the whole of the United States is a slave society. Whereas Southerners believe if you prohibit the spread of slavery into the West, you're making a statement that slavery is a wrong, and that's going to set it toward, as Lincoln says, the course of ultimate extinction. And there are other fears too about economic life and part of slavery's expansion prevents the compression of slavery being worked into just one corner of the United States, and how that is going to make things a little more unstable and kind of like a pressure cooker. So that's what Lincoln is on about as he's talking about the questions in this address, right? But notice too the humor of how Lincoln is able to very bitingly take down his opponents. At the top of page 658, just take a look at this joke. This necessity had not been overlooked, but had been provided for as well as might be in the notable argument of squatter sovereignty, otherwise called the sacred right of self-government, which latter phrase, though expressive of only rightful basis of any government, was so perverted in the attempt to use it as to amount to just this, that if any one man choose to enslave another, no third man shall be allowed to object. So Lincoln's noting here with a bit of, you can almost hear him smiling as he's delivering this line, right? Basically, everyone out there, all the pro-slavery advocates, they defend the right of slavery as the sacred right of self-government. And Lincoln's pointing out what they mean by that is that if one man chooses to enslave another, I'm not allowed to criticize him. Or I'm not allowed to say what he's doing is wrong. Right? The right of self-government doesn't give you the right to do anything you want. There are restrictions on it. Sometimes those restrictions are moral in nature. And what is considered moral in nature frequently reflects the cultural conditions, reflects the certain stances of the law. Lincoln provides an analysis of the Dred Scott decision, and he reflects, I think, one of the key concerns of the Dred Scott decision, which is, to him, it seems awfully convenient that Congress passes a law that's endorsed by the president governing something with the territories. Then the Supreme Court case comes down. He describes it as fitting a nice little niche, as if Congress left just a little bit of room for the Supreme Court to plop in a decision right in the middle so that everything lines up together. Lincoln's using his analytical skills to look out at what's going on and is trying to draw attention to the forces that are moving the country in a certain direction. He says at the top of page 662, welcome or unwelcome, such decision is probably coming. This is where he's reflecting on, if we don't act now, if we don't push back on this now, if we don't stop the advancement of this now, a decision on slavery's legal status everywhere in the nation is probably coming. Welcome or unwelcome, such decision is probably coming and will soon be upon us, unless the power of the present political dynasty shall be met and overthrown. We shall lie down pleasantly dreaming that the people of Missouri are on the verge of making their state free. And we shall awake to the reality instead that the Supreme Court has made Illinois a slave state. Lincoln puts the work of Stephen Douglass front and center as a component of this conspiracy. And he recognizes the fact that Douglass himself frequently took no hard positions on the idea of slavery. But where Lincoln criticizes Douglass is in the idea that Douglass says, it's whatever the people want. And Lincoln seizes on that as a problem because he recognizes that there is no principle that's governing Douglass. And he uses it as an opportunity to say that he himself is a man of principle. Right? He says this on the top of 663. Basically, Douglass's position is, I don't care what you decide. And Lincoln says, our cause then must be entrusted to and conducted by its own undoubted friends, those whose hands are free, whose hearts are in the work, who do care for the result. Right? Douglass is trying to walk this middle line, this, if you want it, that's great. If you don't, that's fine. I don't really care. And Lincoln says, the fact that he doesn't care shows that he's not really in it for the right reasons. And by implication, Lincoln is suggesting he is in it for the right reasons. We'll get back to Lincoln when we turn to the poetry of the Civil War. But in the meantime, what I want to do now is I want to talk a little bit about Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin. So I ask you to take a look at 2 chapters from Uncle Tom's Cabin. Unfortunately, we don't have the time in our course to read the entirety of Uncle Tom's Cabin. I wish we had the time to read all of Moby Dick and the time to read all of Uncle Tom's Cabin, but unfortunately, we don't. Uncle Tom's Cabin is arguably the most influential book outside of the Bible of the 19th century in America. It's a book that people have pointed to as an example of a book that can change the course of history. And that's probably overselling it a little bit. But I want to make clear a couple of things. Uncle Tom's Cabin is not a book that is famous because it's anti-slavery. In fact, the anti-slavery or abolitionist cause was still trying to find its footing, still trying to establish itself at the time that the novel was presented. And many publishers at the time were worried about selling abolitionist works because they didn't feel like there was going to be enough profit in it. So Uncle Tom's Cabin is a successful novel because it's a successful work of literature first. Then it becomes a successful work of anti-slavery literature. And that's an important thing to say about Uncle Tom's Cabin. From our own perspective today, I think we can look at Uncle Tom's Cabin as a less successful work of literature, although that's being reappraised, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the reappraisal on Uncle Tom's Cabin here in just a moment. But it's a novel that, from our current perspective, maybe feels a little rigid, maybe feels a little overly emotional, maybe feels unsubtle. And those are typically associations that are not, or typically characteristics that are not associated with works of great literature. But those are traits that are contextual. Those are traits that are debatable. What a culture considers a great work of literature at one time is not necessarily what a culture will consider it in the future. Right? Look no further than the fact that Uncle Tom's Cabin comes out in 1852. It very quickly turns into a bestseller. It's the best-selling novel of the 19th century in America. It has a huge effect. Everyone knows the name Harriet Beecher Stowe. It spawns an entire genre of anti-Tom literature, as it's come to be known. These were novels that were written in response to Uncle Tom's Cabin, to say that what Stowe was writing got it all wrong, right? These are pro-slavery propaganda novels that are being written by women in response to Stowe and her book. And so you can think about the momentum that a text has to have for people to write other novels that are responding to it, and not like subtly responding to it, right? Like overtly responding to it, so much so that there's a whole subgenre of literature named after the work that the work is responding to. Right? That's a huge impact on American literature. Compare that to Moby Dick, published 2 years later, 1854. Right? Moby Dick in its own time is considered a failure of a novel. It's not a bestseller. It doesn't turn out to be the revolutionary novel that Melville wanted it to be. He's not recognized in his own life, and it's only years later that the novel is rediscovered in the early part of the 20th century and thought to be a great work that the people back in the 1850s didn't recognize as a great work, right? Genius was ahead of its time. Well, this is because of the expectations of the culture shifted. And by the 20th century, the types of storytelling that the culture began to value reflected the type of storytelling that was going on inside Melville's text. And by that time, the type of storytelling had shifted and evolved so that the type of storytelling that Stowe was writing felt outdated, felt way too overt, way too loud, way too on the surface, and not enough bubbling under the surface. Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin belongs to a genre called the sentimental novel. And when we take a look at some examples of the text, the scenes in the text, you'll see what I'm talking about. The sentimental novel today is a phrase that's usually pejorative, right? It's not meant to be a compliment if someone calls your novel sentimental. Usually it's used in the context of overtly emotional. It's generally used to be, excessive and unearned emotion. If you ever take like a creative writing course or an intro to literature course, sometimes the story, the idea here is the writing, the emotional feeling at the end of it, is it earned? Or do we have instead very dramatic things that are happening that are kind of preying on the audience's emotions, but there hasn't been a lot of art that's been delivered to it? Sometimes the sentimental novel is thought to appeal to the middle classes, and particularly middle class morality. Good characters and bad characters, or good characters and evil characters. In that regard, Uncle Tom's Cabin is doing something really interesting because Stowe is using characters who have a variety of moral ambiguity to them. A lot of people who think about Uncle Tom's Cabin as a sentimental novel, I think we have to acknowledge this. A lot of people see the dismissal of the sentimental novel as a genre as sexist. Because a lot of the novels that fell under the sentimental novel banner are written by women, read primarily by women, or targeted more primarily to women, whereas the writers of the 19th century who were wrote the real literature, they weren't writing the real or they weren't writing sentimental novels. They were writing, hard-nosed, tough, intellectual, psychologically probing novels. Those were written by men. So in the later part of the 20th century, there's been a reassessment of Stowe and a reassessment of the works of sentimental novels of the 19th century as novels that have been neglected through scholarship over the years because they may have been dismissed, right? There's always been a tension between art and commerce, right? Is a successful work of art something that's commercially successful? There would be people who say, mainstream or pop art can't ever have anything profound to say. That the real art is the stuff that the society rejects or pushes against. The real art comes from misunderstood geniuses, right? The real art comes from people who aren't trying to make a dollar. And we see this even through to today, right? The types of movies that usually get honored with awards tend to be more art house films, less, sort of mainstream, populist fare. Books that are taught in college courses, even this one could be accused of it, have more of the literary, the hard-nosed literary sense to them. And yet we find that there's often a tension because the popular books are often the ones that endure in time, right? George Orwell has an essay discussing what he calls good bad books, where he, says that Uncle Tom's Cabin is probably likelier to endure over time or to be still talked about and still read, and all of the works of Virginia Woolf will fall by the wayside, even though he can't really point to what it is that makes Woolf's works better than Stowe's works. But the overall popularity gets put in. So I think there's probably a bit of envy on behalf of writers who were not successful, but also a kind of sense of how standards change over time. One of the other problems with Uncle Tom's Cabin is, while it is an explicitly anti-slavery novel, it wears its politics on its sleeve, it's also a novel that has some difficult representations of black characters. Stowe does engage in some characteristics engages in characterization of black characters, many of which were picked up and were transformed into stereotypes of black people, and that can be traced back to Uncle Tom's Cabin. Part of what is being developed there, though, is the fact that most people experienced Uncle Tom's Cabin through stage performances in the 19th century. The novel itself was very successful, but the novel was adapted into plays, and more people saw it through performances than read it. It was a very best-selling novel, but it was estimated that by 1900, 250,000 performances of Uncle Tom's Cabin had happened all around the United States, north and south, with lots of varying politics too. Some performances were very faithful to the spirit of Stowe's book. Others twisted Stowe's message into a pro-slavery message. One of the reasons they were able to do that was there was a very loose copyright law at the time. So no stage production was ever authorized by Harriet Beecher Stowe. So it's a highly influential book. It's a sentimental novel. It created a firestorm. It put a lot of anger on the injustices of slavery, and particularly on the Fugitive Slave Act. It's a controversial book that was rejected by Southerners, and Southerners wrote novels against it. And as I said, it's a book that has a mixed legacy to this day, in part because of Stowe's awkward and clumsy handling of some issues related to race, but also for the fact that it's a very sentimental novel that wears its emotions on its sleeve. This is, I think, really on display in the way the novel speaks to the audience. Look on page 774. The question here about the enslaved woman Eliza, who is running away from the Shelbys because they are being forced to sell some of the people who they have enslaved in order to pay down debts. And Eliza is scared that she and her son, Harry, are going to be separated from each other as a result of the sales. Stowe writes on the top of page 774, if it were your Harry, mother, or your Willie that were going to be torn from you by a brutal trader tomorrow morning, if you had seen the man and heard that the papers were signed and delivered, and you had only from 12 o'clock till morning to make good your escape, how fast could you walk? How many miles could you make in those brief few hours with the darling at your bosom, the little sleepy head on your shoulder, the small soft arms trustingly holding on to your neck? The way that the narrator in here turns and speaks to the audience to purposefully ask them to empathize with Eliza as opposed to building a kind of empathy within the text of Eliza. There's a famous moment I ask you to read. It's the chapter where Eliza escapes by jumping on the ice floes in the Ohio River. It's wintertime and she's jumping on the ice floes in the Ohio River to move from Kentucky, which is a slave state, into Ohio, which is a free state. The Ohio River doesn't have ice flows like that, but it's all in service of the emotion that we're supposed to feel as she escapes, and just the nick of time to jump from ice floe to ice floe to ice floe until she manages to reach the other shore of the river. You can see, I think, a lot of the sentimentality and the overt political writing in the excerpt of chapter 9 that I gave you. And this involves Senator Byrd and Mrs. Byrd. These are two characters that are meant to explicitly discuss laws similar to the Fugitive Slave Act. Senator Byrd has voted in favor of this bill, and Mrs. Byrd is opposed to it. We see some of this on display on page 784, about halfway down the page. On the present occasion, Mrs. Byrd rose quickly and with very red cheeks, which quite improved her general appearance, and walked to her husband with quite a resolute air, and said in a determined tone, "Now, John, I want to know if you think such a law as that is right and Christian. You won't shoot me now, Mary, if I say I do. I never could have thought it of you, John. You didn't vote for it you didn't vote for it. Even so, my fair politician," he says back to his wife, "you ought to be ashamed, John. Poor, homeless, houseless creatures. It's a shameful, wicked, abominable law, and I'll break it for one if the first time I get the chance. And I hope I shall have a chance. I do. Things have got to a pretty pass if a woman can't give a warm supper and a bed to a poor, starving creatures just because they are slaves and have been abused and oppressed all their lives, poor things." The senator responds, "But Mary, just listen to me. Your feelings are all quite right, dear, and interesting, and I love you for them. But then, dear, we mustn't suffer our feelings to run away with our judgment. You must consider it's not a matter of private feeling. There are great public interests involved. There is such a state of public agitation rising. We must put aside our private feelings." And she says, "Now, John, I don't know anything about politics, but I can read my Bible. And there I see that I must feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and comfort the desolate. And that Bible I mean to follow." And then she says, not a word he says could change her mind, and she hopes she has the opportunity. And lo and behold, Eliza and her son arrive just at that time so that she can share share how she's going to help. And Senator Byrd also moves away from his feelings and helps Eliza and Harry as well, right? In fact, Stowe says on page 791, discussing the senator, he was as bold as a lion about it, and mightily convinced not only himself, but everyone that heard him. She's talking about the passage of the bill. But then his idea of a fugitive was only an idea of the letters that spell the word, or at most the image of a little newspaper picture of a man with a stick and bundle with "ran away" from the subscriber under it. The magic of the real presence of distress, the imploring human eye, the frail, trembling human hand, the despairing appeal of helpless agony, these he had never tried. He had never thought that a fugitive might be a hapless mother or a defenseless child, like that one which was now wearing his lost boy's little well-known cap. And so, as our poor senator was not stone or steel, as he was a man, and a downright noble-hearted one too, he was, as everybody must see, in a sad case for his patriotism. And you need not exult over him, good brother of the southern states, for we have some inklings that many of you, under similar circumstances, would not do much better. Be that as it may, if our good senator was a political sinner, he was in a fair way to expiate it by his night's penance. And that's the final thought that I want to give to Stowe's novel here. One of the interesting dynamic things that we don't quite get across all the characters, but you can see on display with Senator Byrd in the excerpt that I asked you to consider, is that Stowe, rather than writing a novel where the line is cut into good and evil, Stowe populates her novel with morally ambiguous characters. And Senator Byrd is a really good example of this. He's the example of a character who, on his own, as a senator, votes in favor of a bill that makes it harder to help fugitives from slavery. But once he's confronted with somebody who is an actual fugitive from slavery, he realizes that what he's engaged in is legislating based on the idea of something. As Stowe puts it, right? He didn't know his idea of a fugitive was only an idea of the letters that spell the word fugitive, right? He's got an abstracted view of what this means. But once he becomes face to face with a human being who has experienced the horrors of slavery and is attempting to flee the horrors of having her family separated, then that's when he finally understands. Right? He's a morally ambiguous character. Other characters in the novel are depicted in morally ambiguous way. Even Eliza's enslaver, George Shelby Sr., is described as a fundamentally good person. He enslaves people, he owns other human beings, but he's described as a good person who finds himself forced to sell off the people he owns to pay down debts. It's almost like he doesn't want to do it, but he has to do it. Augustine St. Clair, another character who appears later in the novel, does not condone slavery, and he believes God is going to punish the United States for slavery, but nevertheless, he enslaves people. Miss Ophelia, a northerner, plays a role in coming down to the South. She's deeply opposed to slavery. She's from Vermont, a state that never had slavery, right? She's deeply opposed to it, but she's racist to her core. She has significant trouble interacting with black people in the novel. by creating a world of morally ambiguous characters. Now, Stowe also creates characters who are so good they kind of strain credulity. And that's where the character of Tom comes in, right? And the insult, Uncle Tom, or Tom, has come from the idea that here's a character who acquiesces so much. But Tom lays down his life in the course of the novel. He gives in so much. He self-sacrifices so much that he's been, I think, appropriately accused of acquiescing too much to the institution of slavery and lacking and giving up his own agency. Although it's a complicated question, if you choose to give up your own agency, are you in fact having agency? Did Tom ever have agency to start with, though? Another morally difficult question, right? The most evil character in the novel is Simon Legree, who Stowe paints as an opponent of religion, and he's a cruel person who engages in slavery. He's ultimately the murderer of Tom. We have bounty hunters who convert, and they change from their old ways. They find religion, and in doing so, they become opponents of slavery. Right? Stowe is trying to build an argument throughout the novel that it is both the North and the South that are complicit in the perpetuation of slavery, that the North has a responsibility to push harder against the institution of slavery, against legislation that empowers slavery, and that slavery itself is an anti-Christian force. She's a deeply she's a religious woman with deep convictions, and she believes that slavery is anti-Christian. And the novel is designed to function on that level. And so we see, the dialogue between Senator Byrd and Mrs. Byrd, where she says, I'm going to follow the Bible. I don't care what the fugitive slave laws say. The Bible is my guide for right and wrong here, right? The idea that not everything that's legal is moral, and not everything that's moral is legal, is a key idea built into most reform movements like this that concern human rights. Finally, I just want to end our discussion of anti-slavery literature by just drawing your attention to the poems of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Harper was the most popular African-American poet of the 19th century. And I asked you to look at a few of her poems. The Slave Mother asks you to empathize with the woman whose children are taken from her. The Tennessee Hero asks you to connect and empathize with the man who takes the lashes and lets himself die rather than give up the information on those who plotted to escape. But I'm most captivated by, and I think most interested in sharing here briefly at the end of this discussion, the poem Bury Me in a Free Land. You may make my grave wherever you will, in a lowly vale or a lofty hill. You may make it among earth's humblest graves, but not in a land where men are slaves. I could not sleep if around my grave I heard the steps of a trembling slave. His shadow above my silent tomb would make it a place of fearful gloom. The poem ends with the lines, I would sleep, dear friends, where bloated might can rob no man of his dearest right. My rest shall be calm in any grave where none calls his brother a slave. I ask no monument proud and high to arrest the gaze of passers-by. All that my spirit yearning craves is, bury me not in the land of slaves. Interestingly, the title of the poem, Bury Me in a Free Land, is not said inside the poem itself. The poem itself always adopts the language of bury me not in the land of slaves, or not in a land where men are slaves. The emphasis here, both in a sense of abolishing slavery before Harper herself dies, but also in the sense that the profound corruption of slavery would follow somebody even to their death. That there's no sense of good sleep that can come in death if slavery is still a force that's continuing. And we have images here, almost Gothic images, of the dead being unable to rest quietly in their graves if all around them they hear the rattling of chains, the howling of women who are having their children taken from them, the anguish of people who are being whipped and punished, the barking of hound dogs that are chasing those who are fugitives from slavery, the sounds that arrest and prevent the slumber of the dead, in other words, are the sounds that should be horrifying us, the living, to act, to push for the abolition of slavery. It's a beautiful, haunting poem that succinctly captures what needs to happen so that we all can feel like by the time our end is here, we've done our best to improve the society. We're going to finish our discussion of our course with a look at some poetry from the Civil War. That'll be our final discussion of the course. Thank you for joining me for a longer video than normal to talk about anti-slavery rhetoric and literature. And we'll have one more discussion to bring our course to a close.